Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 7. Initiate. There were at least 60 of the scarlet kite-shaped shields propped in the rack mounts. Of these, only 10 or so showed any signs of wear, with tiny chips in the dye-colored surface where the metal blade of an axe, sword, or spear had been applied in vain to breach the rounding. The markings were mute testimony of the skirmishes and battles these protectors had seen, and Gareth felt the alluring, quick pulsation of his blood at the thought of it. The knights and warriors of Arran, the savage hordes of the south, the mythical might of the swarms, these Viron arms had withstood them all and ultimately triumphed. He reached out to let his fingers slide over the embossed gold of the flying dragon. One could almost feel the eagerness of the young soldier in his first battle, the tight apprehension before the first shock of the charging enemy host.
"Dreaming again, boy?"
Euban's words broke through the brief spell. He limped down the narrow passage between the shelves and the further wall, momentarily obscuring the light. His dragging footsteps sounded hollow in the enclosed space. Gareth let his fingers linger a moment longer on the cold chrysolite. He had been aiding Euban since the morning when an irate Malvor had dispatched him to the store. He had fetched and carried, sorted and polished, till after supper before he had been allowed into the Nurian battle store. Here the treasured blades, war shields, and armor of the Nurian host were stowed, in row upon row of crafted excellence. The old man would not let him handle any of the weaponry, but had merely instructed him to dust and sweep the floor like any kitchen boy. He ached to grip the hilt of one of the splendid seer blades, only to measure the weight and power of it. Then the tall shields had captured his attention, and rendered him too quiet for Euban's liking, prompting an investigation.
"You're not the first or the last Nurian child enticed by the power of these. Of course, I've heard it whispered,"
He lowered his voice,
"that the first of our race sprung from a flow of chrysolite. That's why we may bend it to our will."
He winked.
"Don't you go tell the priests I said that."
Gareth chuckled loudly.
"I would be the last to trade confidences with the Black Crows."
He bit his lip, glancing quickly at Euban, who merely smiled.
"Black crows be what they are."
Gareth gestured towards the yard-long metal blades in their neat rows.
"Why is it that they cannot make our blades this long? Then we do not have to train for cycles before we can use them."
Euban drew a Nurian blade from its slot in a rack and held it up to the torchlight.
"There's much about chrysolite that is a mystery, but I know a little about it. Mayhap one day you will be fortunate enough to travel to Argoth's Hand and see the great forges of the Vaedron among the Fire Mountains, as I have."
The boy's face lit up with excitement.
"You saw the Vaedron?"
"That I did. Strange folks they are, with powerful magic to protect them from the incredible heat of the forges. I could not even approach, though I was as curious as you seem to be."
He was staring into the distance, past the rows of armaments.
"They are small in stature, and not ambitious or warlike, but they guard more secrets in the hand than you can dream of. More than one concerns the fashioning of objects from the pools of clear molten chrysolite. See here."
He measured the length of the blade with his claw.
"This is about the length of it that may be fashioned before the construct becomes brittle, and even this takes many cycles to obtain. Look closely at that shield."
He pointed to the one Gareth had been admiring.
"You will see the seams, finer than a human hair, where the slats of chrysolite have been joined to the metal base.
His voice was rapt with admiration.
It is a work of art.
Gareth slipped his arm through the leather straps and lifted the shield from its stand. The pointed bottom crunched into the stone of the floor, while he almost had to stand on tiptoe to see over the rim.
It's quite heavy.
Euban grimaced.
You don't want to face enemy archers or axemen without it. And yet,
He glanced over his shoulder, stepped closer, and lowered his voice again.
there is talk that Nurians formerly had no need of these.
He touched around with a blade in his hand.
In ancient times, there were sets that could protect the entire body.
The boy stared at him open-mouthed.
Like the metal plate.
No. The armor would be composed from its different parts. Like this blade is extended to its fullness. You would have bracers, greaves, a girdle, and such like, all of a type, you see, and these would flow together.
Again there was a nervous glance behind him.
Before Talon became the High Quester, there was a Nurian here who serviced the temple. Willen was his name. Talon made him leave. I had just become Stormmaster on account of this.
He held up his mutilated hand.
But there was a good cycle or so during which I spoke with him on occasion. He it was that told me many of the old legends. But
He shrugged.
what truth there is in it, none can tell.
Why do the tutors never speak of these things?
Euban snorted.
They speak what they are told. They are under the heels of the priests, and mostly they do not know themselves. If the questers knew that I speak so freely of forbidden things.
He rolled back his eyes. Then he seemed to come to himself again.
Lawrence, lost boy, you'll make me talk away the entire night. Put back that thing.
Gareth struggled to fit the kite shield back into its slot.
Do not be too anxious to take up one of these. You will not put it down again until the blood has flowed, and a good proportion of it Nurian.
Euban rested his mutilated hand on the gilded rim in silent corroboration of his words.
All the same, it must be exciting, being on the field of battle.
Gareth was reluctant to let this dream slip away.
Listen to the boy. You've had your nose in too many books. That's the truth. Imran's beard. Exciting indeed.
The old man prepared to leave.
Come along, then. You've labored enough for one day. It's about time you were off to your bed.
He shepherded the boy out of the battle store and locked the door carefully behind him. They passed through the rows of uniforms together and halted briefly at the table where Euban had taken control of the many scrolls and records and sorted them into neat stacks and bundles. His cat was nowhere to be seen.
Has the captain mentioned if you will start training with the intake?
Gareth opened his mouth to reply, but never had the chance. The door leading from the barracks had creaked open, and a muffled voice called out Euban's name. The old man turned pale. He whispered to the boy,
This is excitement, certainly. Quester Talon is paying a visit.
Gareth had no desire to see the quester, whom he did his best to avoid. Talon had never lost an opportunity to upbraid him for his lack of devotion and respect to his studies, and had also been the driving force behind an abortive attempt to pull him into the priesthood. The boy was loath to brave another scorching gaze from the quester's disapproving eyes, accompanied by a lashing from his sharp tongue. He quickly turned to Euban.
I need to disappear, if you don't mind.
Euban smiled, but glanced around fleetingly.
The rag pile? No, you will probably suffocate.
Again there was a call. Gareth's whisper was desperate.
What about the battle store? Give me the key.
Euban replied to the quester's call as he beckoned the boy towards the tapestry spread over the wall behind his table.
Coming, your grace.
He pulled back a corner of the curtain.
Here, there's a little used storeroom behind the tapestry. If you keep still, you will not be noticed.
Gareth frantically wormed in behind the curtain as he heard the footsteps of the priest and the old man's muffled greeting. The little room was dark enough, but his eyes quickly adjusted to reveal what appeared to be a further doorway in the opposite wall, as if he was in an ante-room of some sort. There were no crates or barrels in the room at all. He tentatively approached the gaping hole and peered through. A passage led away into the dark. He hesitated only a moment before stepping through the doorway. Behind him, he could hardly make out the voices of the two men. He had no idea why the quester would visit a mere storeman, or what business they could be discussing. It was tempting to remain in the room, press close to the tapestry, and eavesdrop a little, but then the passage was equally enticing. He could always ask Hubin later what the conversation had been about. Though the passage was dark and twisted steadily downwards, it was easy to feel one's way with the hand running over the rough wall. The floor seemed clear of obstacles and dry. Gareth made slower progress after the third turn. Not a trace of light penetrated the passage now, and though his enhanced sight still brought to him the colorless outlines of the place, he had to move his feet with exploring care, as well as keep wall contact with his fingertips. The noise of the conversation between the quartermaster and quester Talon first receded to an echo, and then faded altogether. The echo of his own shuffling gait told him that the passage was wide enough, perhaps, for 5 men walking abreast. His pulse quickened involuntarily as his fingers ran over a metallic object on the wall. He stopped and explored it with both hands. A strip fastened to the wall with bolts ran upwards to his head height, where it branched outwards in a tubular metal shape. It was merely a wall sconce for when the passage was in use. Further exploration revealed that it did not still hold a torch which he might have used. The metal was cold to the touch, and for the first time he felt a movement in the air, a cold breath from the bowels of the castle, wafting upwards through this outlet. The wall did seem dry and free from lichen or moss, the air fresh and clear, carrying none of the dank, stale smell of enclosed, stony spaces. Not one of his perceptions tallied with what Hubin had said. This was no storeroom, long disused. The sconce had also been free of dust or cobwebs, which suggested recent use or at least careful maintenance. Why had he lied? What secret was here to protect from someone like himself? A strong suspicion rooted itself in his mind. The passage was for access to the temple, and since he was still uninitiated, this was forbidden to him. That would explain Hubin's casual lie. If it were true, though, he should not explore any further, but merely wait quietly close to the curtain in the room above till the quester had spoken his fill. And yet, how could he let an opportunity like this slip by unused? Wouldn't he regret his timidity tomorrow in the brightness of day? As if in answer came a faint noise from below, a whisper of air mysteriously beckoning. What if someone was using the temple even now? But no, there were no ceremonies till the next presentation. What would account then for the slight sound beyond the passage? It could not be rats or mice. Somehow the noise did not fit with living things, unless there was another exploring spectre like himself, venturing into the forbidden. He smiled at himself and turned to trudge down the slope once more. He certainly did not have time to speculate if he wanted to see anything. Talon would not converse forever, and Hubin would overtake him presently when his absence was discovered. The next thought stopped him in mid-stride. How would he see anything down there anyway? He had no torch or means of lighting one if he had. Perhaps a light would be left there. He would not see its illumination till he rounded the last few twists of the passage, especially not if it were only a faint one. Again he heard the slow sigh of air from below. It could not have been more enticing had it called his name. He quickened his pace, stretching out an exploring arm in front of him like a blind man. The new boots were light and soft enough not to cause more than a faint echo from the walls. He opened his mouth and strained his ears for the slightest sound from below. It was strange and eerie to sneak through the silent dark to an unknown destination, and reminded him at once of a comparison one of his many tutors had drawn out for him concerning the quest for true knowledge as opposed to meddling in the dark arts. This man had been a strange character, somewhat soft-spoken in contrast with the rest. Gareth remembered his eyebrows raised in unspoken questions whenever he was contradicted or puzzled. His face had carried the same odd expression when he had completed the instruction, the dark, whirly uncertainty of the arcane, and the bright promise of scholarly achievement. It was as though he had invited an argument, the skeptical refusal to see reason to which he had grown accustomed from his 8-cycle-old princeling student. But the boy had simply stared at the impossible mystery of that dark smear of ink, its forbidden secrets pulling him irresistibly. Something was horribly wrong below him. A prickling sensation spread over his body from the feet upwards, as the walls of the passageway became visible at last in an odd bluish hue. At the same time he knew it would be impossible for him to turn back now. The candle had mesmerized its moth. Whatever peril lay ahead would swallow him up without protest. The sound of his footfalls was lost in the breath of an immense hall or cavern opening up below him. He caught his own breath as if in fear of losing it in the enormity as well. He realized at once that he had no way of descending into the arena-like center of the cavern. He was several score yards away from what he perceived to be the floor, on a stony balcony or alcove, and a sturdy iron grill prevented any accidental or deliberate access. The walls of the cavern stretched away into inky darkness as far as he could see. He could not catch a glimpse of the ceiling, although his reason told him the dome could not possibly reach too far upwards, since the cavern was contained inside Belruth Castle. He gripped the iron bars of the grill tightly and peered down. The blue-white illumination emanated from the middle of the arena. Several structures were marked with patches of blue light that remained motionless, and therefore could not be fires or torches. Perhaps they were crystals of elucidation, but it was impossible to judge from that distance. The light pillars formed a semicircular pattern that somehow seemed familiar to him. In its mouth loomed a massive dark shape with outstretched arms. When his gaze lighted upon it, Gareth realized that this shape was the sole source of his unease. He suddenly remembered to breathe again, and let out his breath in a painful rush. His chest was too tight. Something was pressing down on his mind.
"Yes, I, Quester. You may rely on your humble servant."
Euban took care to keep the leer out of his voice. It would not do to offend the powerful. In Belruth one did not attribute one's position to merit alone. Talon was no fool, but could appreciate the care taken by his lessers to appear polite.
"May the success of our undertakings be thanks enough for your endeavors, Euban. I have held you in esteem ever since the changeling affair."
The voice was slow and measured, slightly lowered from its original pitch, and trained to carry even in open air. Deliberate emphasis was placed on important words, as if he was speaking to a young child.
"I have no reason to doubt your discretion and loyalty. It is for the good of the kingdom, you realize. And as the case with all matters we discuss, it remains between the two of us."
The quester raised a single eyebrow as though he had asked a question. Euban sensed a reply was required.
"As a matter of course, Your Excellency."
The eyebrow dropped to its normal level.
"It concerns the younger prince. He will shortly come to you for uniform and equipment."
Talon paused to allow for the expected consternation this announcement should engender. Euban grew cold. He struggled to feign surprise, while praying to the gods that Gareth would by some miracle not overhear what he knew would follow.
"The younger prince. He could be no more than 12 cycles old."
He stared at the other man with what he hoped would appear to be dismay. Talon allowed a slight smile to flit across his face.
"He is older than the cycles testify, Euban. He has 12, but also a mind of his own, which will sooner or later lead him to misfortune. He refuses to follow the instruction and advice of his tutors, who constantly vex me with complaints about his stubbornness. Moreover, he sneaks off to fraternize with that half-wit you know about, despite repeated and emphatic requests to the contrary. You realize that we cannot allow such conditions to continue. It is grossly inappropriate that he should seek out the company of his own half-brother, whom we took so much care to remove permanently.
Hubin cringed in anticipation of the explanations he would have to give the hidden boy. He cursed his luck for allowing the boy to hide so close at hand. How could he possibly have been so careless?
Do you realize, Hubin, that the king himself does not know what happened to his worthless offspring? If only I had followed my instincts and destroyed him when we had to decide his fate. But that is another matter. We will commence the training early for his own good. He will no longer have time to waste out in the hills with undesirables. I will take a personal interest in his training. Perchance we can reverse the ill effects the efforts of his inept tutors have had. That brings me to the purpose of my visit. I need you to test this boy. What's the matter?
Hubin had turned pale. What he feared was impossible to avoid now. The boy would hear what he should never be allowed to know. Perhaps he could explain his way out of it.
No, Your Eminence, the boy, I understand what is required of me. The information you require will be yours within a 2-day.
He spoke louder to make sure Gareth would hear the words.
I have all the equipment and uniforms he will require. You can trust me to supply him with all he needs.
Hubin struggled to keep the nervousness out of his voice. Unfortunately, the quester also raised his voice in puzzlement.
What are you talking about? I need you to discover his affinity and prepare the temple for a ceremony within 2 days. During the ceremony, the prince will be presented with the other initiates, and I require the information for my divination. Surely you are tired, Hubin, or maybe something else?
There was a hint of humor in the voice, and Hubin forced a smile. He was speechless. No amount of explanation would recover the situation now. The High Quester himself had admitted that his most impressive talent for divination was a lie, and this in the hearing of an uninitiated child. He would have to threaten the boy and swear him to secrecy. To make matters worse, Talon had started pacing up and down while speaking, and had delivered the damaging part of his secret right in front of the tapestry. His dark-robed figure stood out in contrast to the bright crimson of the curtain. The golden dragon seemed poised to pounce on him. For a moment Hubin believed his eyes to be playing tricks. The dragon moved ever so slightly, suddenly a real threat. Then he realized that it was merely the curtain moving. The fool boy! Quester Talon noticed the movement at about the same time. The joviality vanished from his face.
Are we alone?
There was a terrible accusing edge to his words.
A draught.
Hubin's mouth was dry. His tongue felt swollen. In a moment Talon strode up to the tapestry and flung it aside. Hubin glanced down at his own feet, measuring in his mind the chances of a hobbled flight, with the High Quester's guards hot on his heels. If only they killed him quickly. He was too old to stand the torture and interrogation.
Check the other entrances. One of the curtains must be out of place.
Talon's words betrayed a slightly irritated embarrassment. Hubin glanced back at the gaping entrance. The quester had not seen the boy. Perhaps Gareth had retreated further into the passageway when the voices had become louder. He stepped forward himself to peer into the darkness. Blessed be the gods! The boy had some sense after all. It might also be possible that he had not heard anything of the conversation. He found his voice again.
I needed to remove one of the curtains for cleaning, Your Grace.
Lying was suddenly easy.
Yes. Well, I deem it unwise to leave the passages unconcealed. Ever since Malvor's foolish boy stumbled down there, we cannot afford incidents.
But, Your Eminence, Garrett entered through the lower halls. It is impossible to enter from the galleries.
All the same, I would prefer keeping the entrances covered. See to it, Cuban. Do not presume to advise me on this.
Talon had allowed his irritation to sour his mood.
Certainly, Quester. I will replace it before retiring tonight.
Euban felt relief as he regained control over the situation. From one moment to the next, his fortunes had improved dramatically. If Quester Talon would now do him the favor of taking his leave, he could retrieve the boy from his hiding place and determine how much he had overheard, if anything. His Eminence seemed on the verge of complying with this unspoken request. His message delivered in essence, all he needed now was to reiterate and emphasize the need for secrecy.
I need not remind you that this conversation never took place, of course. The test results may be delivered in the usual way. You have been a most faithful ally, Euban. It has not gone unnoticed, I assure you. It will not be long before you receive your just reward. You will know that I value loyalty above all other qualities. A good night to you.
Talon departed swiftly without waiting for a reply.
A most excellent evening to your grace as well.
Euban murmured his reply between his teeth while turning swiftly back towards the exposed entrance. He grabbed a torch from a sconce close by and strode down the passage as swiftly as his hobbling gait would allow him. The boy had wandered further down the passage than he had anticipated. Perhaps he still believed there to be a threat of discovery and would keep retreating before the light.
Boy! Prince!
Euban kept his voice down to an urgent whisper, the echo of which hissed back at him from the walls of the passageway. There was no answering whisper.
It is I, Euban the Terrible.
He chuckled to himself.
The Quester is gone to seek for prey elsewhere. Where are you hiding, boy?
He was more than halfway down the passage when he felt the draught that had stirred the curtain. It carried a scent of hillside and heather, and even a hint of the far-off sea. It was cold and fresh. Euban stopped in his tracks. Something was very wrong. There had, of course, never been another removed tapestry that could have caused the draught earlier. In fact, he had believed the draught had been caused by human hands. Now the flame from his torch was streaming in a veritable breeze. He placed one hand on the knife in his belt and crept noiselessly down the remainder of the passage. All too soon he saw the brightening blue on the walls. Something was happening down below. With a gasp, he rounded the last twist and forgot to close his gaping mouth. The hall was ablaze with blue fire. It ran from the walls in rivulets and cascaded over the stones of the arena. Euban dropped his own pitiful light and raised both his hands to shelter his eyes from the brightness. In the glare, the black crosses of the grills stood out starkly, casting a pattern on the floor and walls of the gallery. Euban searched in vain. There was no sign of the boy. They were torches, after all. The flames did not move or flicker, even when he snatched his fingers through them. They were strange and cold to the touch, at once frightening in their otherness, yet soothing and oddly comforting. Torches of stone, for these were no crystals. The fire was not contained, but flowed freely from the rock. There were 3 on either side of the imposing central figure, which reached at least 20 feet upwards from a little raised dais. In front of the form, a larger glow invited close inspection. This particular stony torch was ensconced in some reflective substance, like brass. It seemed twice as powerful as the others. Moreover, it was raised 2 feet higher, forcing the gaze upwards to the mammoth image. Gareth felt his heart lurch. They were not arms, they were wings. It was a great winged man, roughly hewn out of the massive stone. Half bird, half man, his broad wings reached high to the invisible ceiling. The blue light reached with them higher, till the walls cast it back and forth. The face gazed down in a thousand-worded silence, at once robbing the onlooker of speech and thought. Here were the answers to questions he could not formulate, locked in an image, still out of reach, and yet, forcing his buckling knees to move, he crossed the dais. At once the flames moved and stirred, fanned by an unseen wind. There it was, wafting over him its hint of meadow and woodland at eventide, whispering of the ocean. The stone itself was warm to the touch, lifelike. The grass reached to his knees, rolling away swiftly in the starlight. Far below, the faint rush of waves vindicated perceptions of the wide-ranging, unobscured horizon. The stars were closer, brighter, the air clearer, more alive. The voice, too, was more urgent and intense than the jaded, discordant mumblings that were the voices of men. It spoke in the mind, the ears, every fiber of the body, its meaning clear and divorced from the association of mere language.
Kereth ap nuar, seth sempera, rond earth in lam cultur, foda hu in estrante, meth apiram urmerie.
Gareth dropped to his knees and closed his eyes against it. Each inflection carried its own world of meaning, conjuring its own horrors and sick fear, or radiating bright hope and the ache of longing. Image followed image, irresistible, enormous.
Ah, merloth redran pulis. For andre nenesloin, loth ab get usandith, ve suet tinundre.
A small child was crying hopelessly. A tall man walked away from a foundling in the night. The hungry thronged the streets in desperation, fear their only nourishment. Eyes glared at him with hate. The clash of swords echoed in valleys and towns. Long-fanged creatures swarmed over the meadows like a plague. A woman, ill with power, dripped poison from long fingernails. Near-naked hordes groaned under the lash. An old man frowned and shook his head sadly. A crowned figure strode slowly through a burning city. And throughout it all the tall man walked as if he never meant to stop. He had to stop. This became Gareth's obsession. He would call to him. If he only knew his name. He had to turn him back. The incantation had ceased. He was on the shore now, still kneeling. The sky was strangely empty, as if someone had snuffed the stars. The emptiness was stealing into him, too. He was too weary to resist. He brought up a handful of sand and let it run through his fingers. There was someone else on the shore. A figure was standing quietly off to his left, between him and the lapping waves, looking at him. It was the birdman. Gareth opened his mouth to speak, but his tongue was too large and then too small, refusing all attempts at moving it. All he could come out with was incomprehensible noise. The man at once raised a hand, and he gave up.
Kereth, you are young to call from a forgotten world.
It was the same voice. Its warm power surged through him, spilling from his eyes in unnoticed tears.
I have forsaken those who have forsaken me.
The man cocked his head to the side, forcing the resemblance to a Broadwing.
Use the gifts I gave, Kereth. Follow the sight. I have other children who have not forgotten.
He turned as if to leave.
Who are you, sir? Where?
The face was stern, impassive. Then it softened for a moment.
You have a true heart, Kereth. Save them if you care to.
Something pressed against his right cheek, hard and unyielding. Someone was shouting, mindless with fear. Hands grasped him roughly by the shoulders. At once the pressure on his cheek relented. Then he was turned over and shaken like a rag. It seemed a good idea to open his eyes. This he proceeded to do with some caution. In the dim light he could barely make out the face of the man leaning over him.
Mercy! You're still with us! Boy, you were close to sending me to the darkest pit in all of Nuria. By Lawrence plague-ridden privates! How did you get down there? What did you do? The flames are gone out. Only the large one is still flaring. If I were a superstitious man, which I'm not, mind you, I'd swear to Viron. Confound it, boy, what did you do? I saw the walls all covered in flame, the wind moving.
Euban's voice failed him. His mouth was still agape in amazement, his grip on Gareth's shoulders unrelenting when his good sense returned.
We have got to get out of here, boy, and quickly. Imran only knows who's heard the commotion already. We could never explain those flames.
He straightened up.
Can you walk, Gareth?
The boy nodded his head uncertainly. He felt overpoweringly sick and more than a little confused.
I didn't, sir. I never put the lights out.
His tongue was dragging a little.
Sir, don't you know who it is? It's Euban. It's only old Euban. You don't have cause for concern. Here, let me help you up. We have to get back upstairs, or all the explaining in the realm will be to no avail.
His manner suddenly became urgent. The boy seemed able to stand, but walked slowly and unsteadily. He half dragged, half carried him through the darkness of the temple doorway and up the wide flight of stairs. Gareth became increasingly sure-footed and eventually allowed himself to be towed along by the hurrying Euban. After climbing steadily for a while, they entered a side passage through a heavy door Euban had left open in his headlong rush to get down to the arena. He locked the door now, letting out his breath in relief.
Well, now we have no idea who was in the temple this night. No idea. No, we were asleep at the time.
He chuckled nervously to himself.
At least one of us was, eh, boy?
His familiar cackle echoed up the stairs. It was mead. He could smell the sickly sweetness of it. At once his stomach convulsed.
No, Euban, just cold water, please.
He pushed away the proffered cup.
Hold still right there. I won't be a moment.
The old man scurried off. Gareth felt his head clearing slowly. The dizziness retreated, taking with it the aching nausea. What had happened to him? He remembered every detail of the dream, yet it was painful to scroll through the images, the strange incantation had conjured in his mind. Then there was the Birdman, and the strange words of which he could make no sense. Most of all, he relived the urgent need to halt the walking man while knowing in his heart that it was futile.
Here, a whole picture. Splash yourself with it. It'll do you good.
Gareth let the cold water trickle into his hands and then covered his face with it. At once he thought of the mirror pool and another dream. Somehow it felt ages before. He took the pitcher from Euban and poured some more water over his upturned face. It felt better than he had expected. Then he drank deeply, ignoring the protests from his insides. He smiled at Euban.
Thank you. I guess I'll be off to bed then. Don't want to make you a liar after all.
That's it? You think you're getting away that easy? I have at least 5 score questions that need answers, unless I am prepared to forfeit my sanity. And no one's off to bed till I have answers.
Gareth sighed.
I don't know, Euban. I feel rather strange. Anyhow, I don't think I can give you the answers you want.
Euban turned towards him, pinning him to the chair with his gaze.
How about the truth, and not the answers you think I would like to hear?
I'll tell you what I can.
Gareth sounded as tired as he appeared.
Right. For starters, what did you hear of what Quester Talon and I were talking about?
A little shock went through the boy. The events earlier that evening had slipped from his memory.
What you spoke of? I had not the slightest interest. He would have me in the priesthood, you know. I tried to avoid him as best I can. And I didn't linger behind that tapestry. I headed down the passage almost immediately.
He grew suddenly suspicious.
Why? Were you discussing me then?
Euban was slightly uncomfortable.
No, or yes, we were, in fact. if you have to know. But I'm asking the questions here.
He wagged a playful finger, hiding his relief.
How, by Peleus pointed... How did you get down in that arena? There is no way through that grill, and if there were, you'd break every bone in your body leaping down from that height.
His eyes were strangely dilated, carrying traces of fear and disbelief. Gareth could think of no reply to make to this accusation.
I don't know for the life of me, Euban. I stood there, looking at the blue lights, and then there I was, touching them.
Touching them? What? Are you insane, boy? Only the priest?
I didn't put them out, Euban. I moved my fingers through the flames, that was all. It was only when I felt the stone that I must have fallen.
You touched the stone, too? Boy, you are the greatest blasphemer Myril has ever given birth to. If I were a superstitious man, I'd be hard-pressed to discount the rumors now. What? Touch the stone? And you're hardly weaned from your mother, too? I might be damned to the pits only for being in the presence of such a sacrilegious malefactor as you. Gods and goddesses, where did you get the nerve?
He broke off in mid-sentence. The boy was looking at him oddly.
What rumors?
It was a cold accusation.
What did I say?
Euban seemed a little confused. His face was slightly flushed.
You said you wouldn't discount the rumors. What are they?
Rumors are rumors. Kitchen talk. It causes the bread to burn. Who needs rumors when they've seen for themselves? How did you get that fire on the walls? By Lauren's stubborn soul, boy, the flames are out. The flames. The questers will take apart the whole of Belruth, stone by stone, to find the culprit. If they had any inkling that I was involved, so to speak, death would be a mercy, boy, a mercy.
Euban's voice sounded slightly hysterical.
And these rumors, they concern me?
Murloth's breath! The boy's insane! Get your carcass off the bed and leave me in peace. I'll have to find a strong wine if I intend getting any sleep this night.
Gareth prepared to leave.
What will you tell the questers?
He already knew the answer.
The questers? Nothing? I saw nothing. I was in bed all night with a good bottle. Slept like a log. No idea who could have been in the temple. Not me. I'm only a storeman after all.
It sounded as if Euban was trying to convince himself as well as the imaginary priests.
Good night then, Euban. I'm sorry. I should have stayed behind the curtains as you told me to.
No, yes, behind the curtain. Oh, I need a good draught.
Euban trudged off somewhat unsteadily, leaving Gareth to make his own way back to his room in the dark. The day dawned like any other. Slowly the inky eastern black pulled away from the rim of Myril, paling the stars to insignificance. There was the cold blue harbinger of golden day, lining the horizon in dull-shadowed hilltops, mountains, and trees. Then the bright questing orb of Imran flashed its long arms across the sky, emerged, bulged, and slipped free of the world's embrace to cast these shapes in their true form. Vast and open was the sky, now free of its blanket of dark. Wide and sweeping lay the meadows and fields in glittering early green. Livestock trudged along familiar pathways to their pastures, while the watchers on the walls and at the gates straightened up in anticipation of their morning relief. Gareth saw the first rays of the sun touch the stones of his window-sill. He had viewed the spectacle so many times before, and had felt the alluring call of sun-tide landscapes and adventure. Yet this day his limbs were heavy, and his mind objected to the intrusion of wakefulness that immediately brought with it the stir of memory and puzzlement. He closed his eyes again to banish the light. At once painful incantations and horrid images closed in upon him. He groaned and turned onto his back, placing an arm across his eyes in an effort to force back the sights and sounds of another world. He lay quite still for a moment or two, trying to think of nothing. Then he shuddered and flung aside the sun-tide covers. He needed to see the clear sky and breathe in the fresh morning. Once he was on his feet and staring unseeingly at the battlements opposite his window, he could tentatively take stock of the previous night's events. What had been said had been stored in indelible images in his mind, and yet the urgency of the message had been, and was now, more intense than any half-comprehended picture. It had changed him somehow, that he knew. He was older now, and some odd new burden pressed out the carefree existence of a young child. The dreams he had had before, the visions and phantasms, had in some way reached out and touched him. Or had he touched them? He looked down at his limbs, then slowly followed the line of his arms to his hands. These he held up to the brightness, letting the light reach between his fingers and render the extremities pinkly transparent. He was just the same as yesterday, his body, his hands. He was still the son of Fengor and Ethera, and yet he was more than that. The light playing through his fingers was the same as it always had been, and it was different, as his awareness of it had changed.
Don't move around so much.
Euban's voice betrayed his irritation.
Lauren's lies, boy. This is more important than you can imagine.
What is it for, then, Euban?
He had asked this question several times before without receiving any satisfactory answer.
I'll ask the questions, and you simply respond to them. That's all you need to know. Every initiate goes through the same process. We need to determine whether... We need to see what you will be most suited for when the training starts. Not everyone can be a guardsman, royal or no.
But you said that I would be one, whether I could compose a seer or not. Simply because...
Yes, I know what I said. And it's true, mind you. But your training will be different, of course. Now hold your tongue and close your eyes.
The tone brooked no argument.
Answer truthfully this time, or I'll hand you over to the priest for this little ceremony.
Gareth did not dare point out the silliness and absurdity of most of the questions that followed, though he could not prevent himself squirming from time to time. The old man had not performed the test of affinity for many cycles, and had therefore forgotten most of the questions meant to occupy the candidate's mind, while he looked for the telltale illuminations on the lodestone. He had to make them up as he went along, and his mind was not as agile as it used to be. Furthermore, all the interruptions from this restive candidate only served to unnerve him even more. He would have preferred to blindfold the boy, as they did the candidates in the temples, to prevent him from glimpsing what he should not see. He was convinced now that the reason for not testing boys at this age was that they did not possess enough intelligence to be suitably impressed by the proceedings, or they would refrain from asking questions themselves instead of merely responding when spoken to. There was worse to come. The lodestone obstinately refused to yield any result that could fit one of the Neurian patterns of affinity. If he had not personally been acquainted with the boy's origins, he would have sworn that he had no Neurian ancestry at all. At last he could think of no more questions to pose without making it seem completely ridiculous. His frustration got the better of him.
Confound it, boy. You've ruined the whole test process. You should never have ventured into the temple. There's a good reason it's forbidden to uninitiated whelps.
Gareth removed his hands from the stone, opened his eyes, and sat back. He appeared mystified by the whole affair.
But what do you need to learn about me, Euban? What do you want to see?
He looked at the lodestone with its patterns and symbols.
Why do I need to touch it? I will tell you the truth.
He reached out as if to examine it.
No, you're enough of a problem to me as it is.
Euban quickly replaced the shroud-like covering over the stone, placed his elbows on the table, and rested his deeply lined chin on his hands. He regarded the boy in exasperation. Unthinkingly, the boy mirrored this action on his side of the table. A little frown creased his brow, and at once reminded Euban of his father, when the latter had been an inquisitive boy. This boy would also have no trouble learning the art of the seer blade, even if the test would not declare it. Of that he was certain. What was he to tell the questors then? Talon relied on this information to perform his so-called divination during the presentation in the temple. The king insisted that this boy should be included in the ceremony. If the boy could not be tested, he did not know how Talon would explain to the king that his divination could not succeed in disclosing the prince's affinity. How could he explain to the quaestor that the test had somehow lost its power? The divination for this boy would have to be postponed, even though he was presented as an initiate. He would use the boy's age as a possible explanation for the failure of the test, but that would only serve as a short-term solution and not solve Talon's problem during the ceremony.
Why are you so concerned, Euban? Is there something the matter with me?
The old man sighed and slowly rose to his feet.
I suspect that you are still too young for the presentation, that is all.
Then why did they not leave me alone?
Gareth knew the answer.
The king insisted. You will have to inquire of him.
Is it so important? What does it mean?
Gareth had also risen to his feet. Euban looked straight at the frowning face.
It simply means there will be no blade for you tomorrow.
Because I cannot pass your test.
There is no test, I said. Did you not hear it?
There is no test.
Correct.
Euban sat back and folded his arms. A heavy sigh escaped him.
May I ask you something, Euban?
Not if it has anything to do with what we just did.
No, it does not.
Gareth's fingers toyed casually with the tasseled edges of the shroud.
What did you tell the quaestors about the flames?
The old man shrugged.
Nothing. They never asked me about them. Perchance the flames had gone out before, or by themselves, or it never occurred to them that I could have been involved. Not that I was.
He added hastily.
What in the name of sweet forgetfulness did you do in the temple? How did you get down to the stone?
Gareth glanced up at him, frowning.
I can't explain anything. It was like a dream, a nightmare, but real.
Euban was staring past him now, again seeing the impossible sights he had witnessed.
All the walls were running with fire, like some old tale Willen used to tell of the time before the summoning, of great deeds and Viran lords clothed in the art.
For a moment their eyes met.
It felt as though I had stumbled into one of his stories,
His good hand gripped the boy's arm.
as though the ancient Viran had stepped out of their tombs to trouble the world again.
Prince Lucain placed his empty goblet carefully on a low table. He straightened up with the same deliberate care before addressing his father.
And do you regret it now?
Haven't I regretted it these past 12 cycles?
The words were vehement, barely hiding the intense emotion behind them.
Then allow me to undo the second part of your curse.
Lucain's eyes were cold and calculating. His gaze measured the reluctance and eagerness of his father's mood. His face, framed by the same brown curly hair of his father, betrayed nothing of this careful scrutiny.
What do you propose?
Fengor found that his mouth was a little dry, as if in apprehension.
We will simply let his dark dabbling catch up with him. Let the tree spirits come and fetch him then, far away from the castle, where no suspicion can be turned towards us. He loves sneaking off into the hills. Let us use it to our advantage.
You would risk an assassination?
Fengor shrugged hopelessly.
Your testimony would never stand up to the inquiry. The result would only be banishment for a kin murder.
Lucain half smiled in reply.
Allow me to set your mind at ease. I will not be involved, directly or indirectly. Certain non-Nurian allies of ours have urgent need to dispose of our mutual irritation. I will simply permit them to do what they intend. This is vague enough to be hidden, even from a truth council, if it comes to that.
Mayhap I should have allowed Talon to have his way with him.
I've never been at ease about allowing him into my household,
Fengor did not keep the bitterness out of his voice.
and at times the very sight of him stirs feelings I never would have believed I could be capable of.
I take it you agree in principle, then, if the risk of discovery could be removed?
You are not foolish, Lucain. I know if there would be a way to achieve this, you would find it.
He looked fondly at his son.
You bring honor to the memory of your mother. Why I had to lose her.
2 gentle raps on the door of the private chamber brought him back to present matters. He gave a single sharp command, and an elderly guard opened the door slightly and poked his head through the gap. He spoke in undertones, as if he did not wish to disturb the important discussion of the royals.
The prince is here, sire.
Fengor glanced at his son before replying. Lucain kept his gaze neutral, but the shadow of a smile played on his lips. He gave his father a small, almost imperceptible nod.
Let him enter.
The head disappeared, and the door was pushed open fully. Gareth stepped through the doorway, eager and bright-eyed. Lucain strode forward to meet him, his smile wide and welcoming.
Ah, little brother, we were discussing you this very moment.
He took hold of the boy's shoulders and gave him a friendly shake.
Are you pleased with your early presentation? I would have given anything to be in your position when I was your age.
Fengor forced himself to emulate this jovial mood of his son.
Welcome, Gareth. I trust that you're happy with my decision to place you with Captain Melvor and not Quester Talon.
Yes, father. Delighted.
Gareth did not have to force a smile. He was touched by the somewhat unexpected warmth from his half-brother and the attention from his father. Here was evidence that they were both more aware of and concerned about his welfare than he had believed. The flamboyant Lucain, whom he admired ardently, had treated him with something akin to disdain during the past cycle or two, and this meeting seemed to herald a return to the easy friendship that had existed between them before.
That is good. Whatever tradition may demand, I have no great affinity for the priesthood. I was also led to believe that you are definitely not a devoted scholar.
Fengor raised his eyebrows. Gareth felt the blood rush to his cheeks.
I am sorry if I have disappointed you.
He lowered his eyes involuntarily. Lucain slapped him on the back and laughed uproariously.
At least it kept you out of the priesthood, eh?
He stepped over to a low table and beckoned to his brother to follow suit.
We have something special for you, brother. You are of the royal family, and therefore entitled to certain privileges.
He carefully picked up an object from the table and held it out to the approaching boy.
You are entitled to wear a distinguishing mark of some kind, even while in uniform. We have had one fashioned that I'm sure will please you. It will certainly be more suitable than the one you are wearing.
It was an ordinary enough leather girdle, but the clasp was a finely crafted representation of a dragon in flight.
You see this image?
Lucain held the gold dragon clasp up to the light. It flashed delightfully.
There is only one such in all the realm. Henceforth you will wear it, and all the peoples round the inland sea will know you for who you are, the second prince of Nuria.
He pointed to a single sigil on the black leather adjoining the clasp.
This is your naming sigil in the ancient Viron script.
The sigil was inlaid in what appeared to be chrysolite.
No, you need not marvel.
Lucain smiled at the surprised look on Gareth's face.
The questers are aware that royal insignia may still bear these markings, though you'll not find it anywhere else.
The boy took the proffered gift in a daze. It was certainly a marvelous and expensive piece of work. He would be the envy of the other initiates. It felt heavy and solid in his hands. Both his father and Lucain were smiling at him now. This was a moment to savor.
Well, son, put it on. It won't bite you. I wear a similar one, and so does your brother.
Fengor folded his arms as he watched Gareth remove his own girdle and strap the new one over the scarlet surcoat. It was easy to note how pleased the boy was. He felt a slight tinge of pity and regret. Things could have been so different. The bitterness drove the smile from his face.
Wear it all the time, as we do.
Lucain was a little more serious now, and his words were slow and deliberate.
It will remind you of who you are, and to conduct yourself accordingly.
Gareth felt the little sting the words of his brother conveyed. He was suddenly filled with a fervent desire to be like him, far more responsible and royal, forsaking his silly, childish notions. He wondered how these two men must see him, a foolish and disobedient little boy. He determined to show them otherwise. There was a companionable fire whispering in the hearth now, and Fingor allowed his thoughts to turn to empty musings as he regarded the lively dance of the flames. The mulled wine aided him, too, in dispelling the faces he did not want to see. Then Lucain returned from escorting the thrilled boy back to the barracks. He was so easy to please with a little attention, Fingor thought. He should have had him sent far away from Belruth. Perchance he would have been...
That's how simple it is.
Lucain poured himself another goblet of wine, and sat down heavily next to his father.
Now it is only a matter of time.
And you will not be involved.
Fingor spoke without blinking his eyes away from the mesmerizing flames.
There'll be no need.
Lucain smiled and drank deeply.